Bruce Lee challenged by female samurai master with sword, defeated her bare hands. 1971, Tokyo. There is a particular kind of silence that only happens in a dojo. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is the hell-breath silence of 30 people who have stopped believing what their eyes are telling them. A silence that fills the lungs like cold water. March 8, 1971. Shinjuku District, Tokyo, Japan. The polished wooden floor of Master Teacher Yamamoto's dojo catches the overhead lights and throws them back in long, amber streaks. The air smells of cedar, of liniment, of decades of disciplined sweat worked into the grain of the walls. 30 advanced karate students sit in perfect rows along the perimeter, their white gi stark and still, their faces arranged in an expression none of them have worn before, somewhere between reverence and disbelief and the cold creeping awareness that they are witnessing something they will tell their grandchildren about. At one end of the open training space stands a 28-year-old woman named Miyamoto Kiko. She holds a katana, a real one. A live blade, a shinken, 3 feet of folded Japanese steel that her family has carried for 6 generations. It last saw real combat in the Boshin War of 1868. Its hamon line, the distinctive wavy temper mark along its edge, catches the light like a slow river. She stands in Chudan no Kami, the middle guard position, blade angled at throat height, weight centered, shoulders dropped, and every line of her body communicating a single thing. Absolute certainty. 10 feet away stands Bruce Lee. Shirtless. Barefoot on the cold wood. Unarmed. His hands are open. This is the story of what happened next. And why the people who were in that room never forgot it for the rest of their lives. The man who would walk toward a sword. To understand what Bruce Lee was doing in that dojo, you have to understand what Bruce Lee was. Not the movie star, not the poster on the wall, but the actual human being who had been quietly building himself into something genuinely unprecedented for the previous decade and a half. He was born on November 27, 1940, in San Francisco, California, in the Hour of the Dragon, a detail the Chinese nurses at the hospital noted with interest. His father, Li Huichen, was a Cantonese opera singer of some fame, and the family soon returned to Hong Kong, where young Bruce grew up in Kowloon. He was a restless, combative child who got into street fights often enough that his parents started paying attention. He was running with gangs by his early teens, a kid with too much energy and not enough direction, and in 1953, when he was 13 years old, his father enrolled him in Wing Chun Kung Fu under a master named Yip Man. That decision changed everything, not just for Bruce Lee, but for every person who has ever stepped onto a mat since. Wing Chun is a southern Chinese martial art born for practical use. No wide stances or dramatic leaping movements. No elaborate forms designed more for beauty than function. Wing Chun operates on the principle of economy, shortest path, maximum efficiency, centerline dominance. It was designed for close quarters, for the tight spaces of city streets and corridors, built around the idea that the simplest technique, applied with perfect timing, will always defeat the most elaborate one. It developed in women, not men. Ing Mui, a Buddhist nun, and her student Yim Wing Chun are credited with its creation, and the art bears the stamp of that origin. It doesn't rely on physical size or brute power. It relies on structure, sensitivity, and the ability to read an opponent through touch. Yip Man was not merely a teacher of techniques. He was a keeper of a living philosophy. And the young Bruce Lee absorbed it with an intensity that his classmates later described as almost frightening. He practiced on wooden training dummies for hours. He drilled chi-sawed sticky hands, the close-range sensitivity exercise that teaches a Wing Chun practitioner to feel an opponent's intention through physical contact before the eyes can process it, until the movements became as automatic as breathing. He was particularly gifted in what Wing Chun calls simultaneous attack and defense. The ability to block and strike in the same motion, turning every incoming attack into an outgoing one. He trained with Yip Man until 1959, when his parents, increasingly alarmed by his street-fighting reputation and a pending gang rivalry that threatened to escalate badly, sent him to the United States. He was 18 years old, legally born American, carrying a few dollars and a chest full of technique. The transformation, America, and the birth of something new. Seattle. Then Oakland. Then Los Angeles. And through every city, through restaurant jobs and acting classes and philosophy courses at the University of Washington, Bruce Lee kept training. But more than training, he kept questioning. He had arrived with Wing Chun as his foundation, and it was a solid one. But the wider world of martial arts, which he began exploring voraciously in the United States, showed him things his base art did not address. He studied boxing with genuine seriousness, absorbing the footwork of Jack Dempsey, the head movement of Muhammad Ali, the explosive economy of the jab. He explored judo and wrestling for their grappling principles. He studied fencing, real European sword fencing, and was fascinated by its concept of the stop hit, the technique of intercepting an attack at its moment of commitment. He looked at Taekwondo's long-range kicks. He studied Filipino Kali and Eskrima from his close friend in Prague Dan Inosanto, which gave him a sophisticated framework for thinking about weapons, their ranges, their limitations, and how an unarmed fighter might navigate them. Each art he encountered, he did not simply add to a growing list of techniques. He put it through a ruthless filter. Does this actually work? Against someone who is genuinely trying to hurt you, trained or untrained, predictable or wild, does this hold up? If it didn't survive that question, he discarded it. If it did, he kept the kernel of it, stripped away anything ceremonial or redundant, and integrated it into a growing personal system. By the mid-1960s, this process had crystallized into something he named Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. The name comes directly from that fencing concept. Intercept the attack at its inception rather than waiting for it to develop. JKD was not a style. Bruce Lee insisted on that, sometimes with visible frustration. It was a philosophy of combat, a framework for approaching any physical confrontation with the question of what actually works at this specific moment against this specific opponent. He described it as scientific street fighting. He called it the style of no style. He meant both those things literally. The famous quote attributed to him captures it exactly. Absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is specifically your own. By 1971, when he walked into that Tokyo dojo, Bruce Lee was 30 years old. He stood approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed around 135 pounds, a frame that registered as small even in the early 1970s. But what lived inside that frame was something that modern sports scientists who have analyzed his recorded movements still struggle to fully explain. His punching speed from a ready position to full extension was documented on film at around 0.05 of a second. His 1-inch punch, a technique he famously demonstrated at the Long Beach International Karate Championships in 1964, could send a grown man stumbling backward several feet from a fist that began virtually touching its target. He performed one-armed push-ups on 2 fingers. He maintained a daily training regimen that ran from early morning through the evening, covering roadwork, strength training, bag work, technical drilling, and weapons defense practice. He was, to put it plainly, one of the most physically and technically developed human beings on earth. And he carried all of it lightly, with a looseness of movement that was itself a technique, what is called in fighting arts the relaxed body before explosion. The art that awaited him Japan in 1971 was a country navigating a complicated relationship with its own history. The post-war economic miracle was in full flower. Tokyo was one of the great modern cities of the world, rebuilt from ash into a gleaming metropolis in less than 3 decades. But underneath the modernity ran deep roots that had not been severed at traditions, disciplines, art forms that connected the present to a past stretching back centuries. Japanese martial arts were not merely sports or hobbies. They were cultural inheritance. Kendo, the way of the sword, emerged from the classical battlefield art of kenjutsu, which itself had been practiced by samurai warriors since the feudal period. The 3 great schools of kenjutsu arose during the Unin War era of the late 15th century, and lineages from those schools survived intact into the 20th century, preserved in the old Ryu, the classical schools, that maintained forms, philosophies, and techniques in their original, pre-modernized state. The katana itself was not merely a weapon. It was, for the Japanese swordsmithing tradition, the highest expression of metalworking as spiritual practice. Swordsmiths prepared their forges with ritual, surrounded the working area with consecrated ropes, dressed in ceremonial clothing. The folded steel that emerged from weeks of controlled heating and cooling and hammering was understood as a living artifact, the soul of the warrior made tangible. A blade that had passed through a samurai family for generations carried with it something that no monetary value could express. This is the world that Miyamoto Kiko had been born into and trained within her entire life. She was 28 years old in March of 1971, the same generation as Bruce Lee, by a matter of months. Her family descended from samurai who had served the Tokugawa shogunate before the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Her great-great-grandfather had been a renowned swordsman. The katana she carried had been in active use during the Boshin War. She had begun training in kendo and the ancient school of Tenshin Shoden Katori Shintoryu, one of the oldest surviving koryu, or classical martial arts schools, in Japan, at age 7. She had trained 6 hours a day for 21 years. She held 5th dan rankings in both kendo and aikido. She had defeated over 200 opponents in competitive matches and had never been disarmed. She had come to Yamamoto's dojo that evening specifically because she had heard Bruce Lee would be there. She was not there to learn the challenge. When Pride Meets Philosophy master Teacher Yamamoto had invited Bruce Lee to his dojo out of genuine curiosity. Yamamoto was a 7th dan karate instructor who had studied under Gichin Funakoshi himself, the man who brought karate from Okinawa to the Japanese mainland and effectively created the modern tradition. His dojo operated under old-school rules. No tournaments, no trophies, no ego performances for the sake of the audience. Serious students. Genuine pursuit of knowledge. Bruce spent the first portion of the evening demonstrating Wing Chun wooden dummy techniques and pad work, the kind of controlled exhibition that shows the shapes of a system, its entry points and angles, and the philosophy of its footwork. The students watched with the focused attention of people who know enough to know what they're seeing. Several were clearly impressed. Miyamoto Kiko stood at the back of the room with her arms crossed. When the demonstration concluded and Bruce opened the floor for questions, she stepped forward before anyone else could speak. Her voice was formal, precise, carrying the weight of someone who has never had cause to second-guess her own expertise. She said something like this. She had watched his demonstration with interest and was not impressed. Techniques against cooperative partners and inanimate training equipment proved nothing about real combat effectiveness. Traditional martial arts had been developed against armed opponents in genuine life-or-death situations, not as entertainment. She believed his methods would fail completely against a practitioner of classical Japanese sword arts. The dojo went quiet. In Japanese martial culture, what she had just done was extraordinary. To challenge a guest, an invited demonstrator, in front of his host, was a transgression of considerable social weight. Master Yamamoto was already rising to his feet, preparing to defuse the situation by asking her to leave. Bruce Lee raised one hand, politely, to indicate he wanted to respond. His Japanese was limited. Through Master Yamamoto translating, he said that he appreciated her perspective. That she was correct that many modern martial arts had lost the thread of practical application. But that effective technique should work regardless of whether the opponent carried a weapon. The principles of timing, distance management, and understanding of mechanical advantage don't change because steel is involved. Kiko's expression hardened. She said, "Principles are abstractions. Reality is steel." She gestured to the katana on its stand near the entrance. Her family sword, she explained. Sharpened for tamashigiri practice, test cutting. If he could defeat her while she wielded it, she would acknowledge his methods had merit. If he couldn't, he should stop teaching students techniques that would get them killed. The room understood the gravity of what was being proposed. A challenge match. An unarmed fighter against a sword master using a live blade. Master Yamamoto stood immediately. This was going to be refused. Bruce Lee raised his hand again. He accepted. With conditions. The blade must be real and sharp, no training sword. She must attack with genuine intent, as she would attack a real opponent. A time limit of 3 minutes. If he could not disarm her or force her to yield within that time, he would acknowledge the superiority of traditional arts. If he succeeded, she would acknowledge that effective technique transcends the distinction between armed and unarmed combat. Kiko nodded once. Sharply. She walked to the sword stand, lifted the katana with both hands, and drew it slowly from its saya. The blade caught the light. Several students gasped. This was a true Shinkan, a live blade, not a practice weapon. Its edge could cut through a rolled straw mat with minimal effort. Against human tissue, the physics were not difficult to contemplate. Master Yamamoto pulled Bruce aside and spoke quietly. This was extremely dangerous. Miyamoto-san was a legitimate expert. Even a shallow cut could sever tendons or arteries. Please reconsider. Bruce smiled and placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. He said he understood the danger completely. He said this was exactly the kind of challenge that tests whether a martial art is practical or merely theoretical. He said he had trained specifically for weapon defense scenarios and that this was an opportunity to demonstrate those principles against the real thing. He walked to the opposite end of the training area, removed his shoes out of respect for the dojo, and stood barefoot on the polished wood. He rolled his shoulders once. Took 3 long breaths. Settled into his ready stance, weight evenly distributed, hands open and relaxed at chest height, the deceptively casual posture of someone whose body is a loaded spring. Master Yamamoto positioned himself as referee. He looked at both participants. Both nodded. He spoke the command. Hajime. Begin. 2 minutes and 45 seconds that changed a life. What happened next has been reconstructed from the accounts of the students who witnessed it because there was no video recording, and Master Yamamoto, at the request of the Japanese Sword Federation, did not publicly distribute photographs or a formal account. But multiple students kept personal notes, and those notes painted a picture with remarkable consistency. Kiko moved immediately upon the command, closing distance with the smooth, measured steps of someone who has spent tens of thousands of hours with a sword in her hands. She adopted Saigon no Kami, point forward, blade aimed directly at Bruce's eyes, a guard position that threatens the opponent's vision while maintaining the sword in a position from which it can attack or defend with equal economy. There is nothing theatrical about Saigon. It is pure and ancient and has worked for 400 years because the human nervous system cannot comfortably process a point aimed at its eyes. Bruce moved laterally, circling. He was reading her. Not reacting yet, observing. In Kenjutsu, the critical distance is called mai, the interval at which an attack becomes possible. Bruce was staying just outside it, watching how her weight shifted when she adjusted, how her hands gripped the tsuka handle, the subtle tells in her shoulders and hips that would precede an attack by a fraction of a second. Kiko struck without warning. A men cut a downward vertical strike aimed at the crown of Bruce's skull. Technically flawless, a blow that would split a rolled straw mat straight through. The blade descended in a perfect arc. Bruce moved his head exactly enough to the left while simultaneously stepping forward toward her, not away from her. This was the counterintuitive heart of Jeet Kune Do's approach to weapons. The instinct says retreat, but retreating keeps you in the sword's optimal range. Stepping in past the weapon's midpoint takes you inside the arc where the blade is mechanically weak. The katana passed through the air where his head had been a fraction of a second before. His right hand shot out in a pack saw, a slapping deflection, striking Kiko's forward wrist at the moment the sword completed its arc, pushing the blade further offline and disrupting her ability to immediately chamber for a second cut. His left hand simultaneously grabbed her right elbow, controlling the joint. The whole sequence took perhaps 2 seconds, but in those 2 seconds he had established a position where the sword was temporarily neutralized. Kiko's training activated the correct response immediately. She executed a tai sabaki, a body rotation technique designed to break free from grabs and re-establish fighting distance. She succeeded in pulling away from his initial control. But the contact had given Bruce something valuable. Tactile information. The Chisaw training, the sticky hands sensitivity he had drilled for 17 years, had given him reflexes in close contact that operated faster than deliberate thought. In those 2 seconds of physical connection, he had registered her strength level, her balance characteristics, her reaction speed, and the pattern of how her body responded to resistance. They separated to neutral distance. Something had shifted in Kiko's assessment of her opponent. She had delivered what should have been a lethal cut and it had found air. She recalibrated. She attacked again with a tsuki, a thrust aimed at Bruce's solar plexus. A faster technique than the men cut, the point moving in a direct line rather than an arc, harder to read and harder to evade. This is where decades of Chi Sa training manifests as something that looks almost supernatural to an observer. His hands moved in what Wing Chun calls Tan Sa and Bong Sa, a deflection and bridging combination, pushing the thrust just enough off-center to clear his torso while closing distance a second time. But Kiko had anticipated the closing. She transitioned into a kesajiri, a diagonal slash across the body, with enough force behind it to sever ribs if it connected. What happened next became the moment that every witness mentioned when they retold the story. Bruce dropped his weight suddenly, not by stepping, but through pure compression of his legs, lowering his entire center of gravity roughly 6 inches in the space of a single breath. The blade passed over his shoulder. Students in the front row later reported they could see individual hairs on his head move in the blade's wake. He was that close. And at the moment the sword completed its diagonal arc, at the precise instant when Kiko's weight was most fully committed to the cut and her base was most vulnerable, Bruce's right leg swept her front foot. A Wing Chun sweeping technique that disrupted her foundation at the worst possible moment. She stumbled. But she didn't fall, and she didn't release the katana. She spun on her back foot, facing him again. She was breathing harder now. She had thrown 2 potentially lethal cuts and 1 lethal thrust, all of them technically correct, and none of them had landed. Worse, he had gotten close enough on 2 of those exchanges to have countered devastatingly if he had chosen to strike. Bruce remained calm. His breathing was barely elevated. They were approximately 90 seconds into the 3-minute limit. The final exchange happened with the speed that distinguishes martial artists from martial artists, the kind of speed where experienced practitioners watching later said they had to reconstruct the sequence from what their memory retained rather than what their eyes had processed in real time. Kiko feinted a high cut. A convincing one, the kind of feint that only works when you've actually thrown the real version enough times that the opponent has learned to respect it. She expected Bruce to respond to the high threat. He didn't commit. He recognized the feint, and when the real attack came in the form of a Suriyaj technique, a sliding motion aimed at his extended arm designed to cut the tendons and disable his defensive capability, his response was something that surprised even those who had been watching closely. Rather than defending the blade, he attacked Kiko's hands. Abaya saw a finger strike intercepted the backs of her hands at the moment of attack, striking the pressured points on the back of her hands with sharp, concentrated force. In Wing Chun, this is called a Bil Ji technique, and its purpose is exactly what Bruce employed it for. To momentarily disrupt grip strength by targeting the nerve clusters in the dorsal surface of the hand. The katana wavered. For just a fraction of a second, her grip lost integrity. That was enough. His other hand wrapped around her right wrist. His body rotated, using his hips as the fulcrum in a technique built from the same mechanical principles as a dozen different grappling arts, Wing Chun's close control, the body mechanics he had absorbed from his wrestling and judo study, the leverage understanding he had built across years of analyzing what actually works when a human body is in motion against another human body. He pulled her forward and down along the line of her own committed force. She had 2 choices. Release the sword, or fall. Her samurai family's centuries of pride would not allow her to open that hand voluntarily. She fell. And Bruce guided that fall. Not a throw for damage, a controlled descent, precise and considered, landing her safely but firmly face down on the dojo floor, his grip maintaining control of her right wrist in the sword hand. He applied a chin-na joint lock, a wrist manipulation that made it mechanically impossible to maintain grip or move the blade. The pain receptors in her wrist fired. Her hand opened by reflex. The katana struck the wooden floor with a sound that every person in that room heard like a bell. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. 15 seconds under the agreed time limit. What the floor witnessed, Master Yamamoto's hand was raised, hovering halfway, frozen mid-motion to signal the end of the match. He was trying to process what he had just seen. Bruce immediately released the lock, stepped back, and bowed. The 30 students erupted in something that wasn't quite applause and wasn't quite conversation, an urgent, bewildered collective release of held breath and disbelief, people turning to each other to confirm that they had all seen the same thing, that an unarmed man had disarmed a 5th dan sword master using a live blade, without receiving a single cut. Kiko remained on the floor for a long moment. She was not injured. She was looking at her empty hand. The katana lay 2 feet away. Bruce walked to where the sword had fallen, picked it up carefully with both hands, properly, respectfully, the way one should handle a katana, and carried it back to Kiko, who had risen to a seated position. He presented it to her formally, blade facing himself. The gesture of non-aggression, the acknowledgement that the weapon belongs to her and that it is honored. He said something like this. She was an exceptional swordsman. Her technique was precise. Her cuts had been genuine, she had fought with full intent and honored their agreement. He had not defeated her art. He had applied principles that work against any attack, armed or unarmed. Timing. Positioning. Understanding of mechanical advantage. The principles that make a technique work don't know whether there is a blade in the equation or not. He said her traditional training was valuable and should be preserved. But all martial arts, traditional or modern, must be tested against resistance to remain alive. Kiko took her sword, returned it to its saya, and performed a formal rei, a deep bow from a seated position. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but utterly clear. She said she had trained with that sword for 21 years. She had defeated over 200 opponents. She had never been disarmed. She said, "You did not use tricks or luck. You understood the weaknesses in sword combat that most unarmed fighters never comprehend, that the weapon is only effective at certain distances and angles, and that controlling the hand that holds the weapon is more important than avoiding the weapon itself." She said, "I was wrong to challenge you with arrogance. I was wrong to assume traditional methods are superior simply because they are old." The deeper meaning, what that floor was actually about, it would be easy to read the story of that evening as a simple story about victory and defeat. Bruce Lee won, Miyamoto Kiko lost, end of story. But that reading misses what actually happened in the Shinjuku dojo on March 8, 1971. What happened was a collision between two philosophies. Two fundamentally different ways of thinking about what a martial art is for. Kiko's position, the position of the classical Japanese sword arts, was that tradition is the repository of real knowledge. That the techniques developed over centuries of actual combat, refined and preserved through lineages of serious practitioners, contain wisdom that newer, more eclectic approaches cannot match. This is not a foolish position. The Koryu, the old schools, survived because they worked. The katana is a masterpiece of engineering refined over 500 years of battlefield application. The forms and techniques of kenjutsu were not invented by theorists, they were distilled from actual experience of what keeps a swordsman alive and what gets one killed. Bruce Lee's position, the position of Jeet Kune Do, was that no approach, however time-tested, is immune to the question of whether it actually works right now against this specific challenge. That the purpose of martial arts study is not the preservation of a tradition but the development of a genuine, living capability. That the moment a practitioner stops asking, "Does this work?" and starts asking, "Is this the correct form?" the art has begun its drift from practical to ceremonial. He had built into his training a specific engagement with the problem of weapon defense. The Filipino Cali and Eskrima he had studied with Dan Inosanto was a weapons-based art that also contained sophisticated unarmed response to weapons. It gave him a conceptual architecture for thinking about the exact problem Kiko had presented. The Wing Chun trapping and sensitivity training gave him the close-range control tools. The Jeet Kune Do framework gave him the permission to use the right tool for the exact moment regardless of which tradition it came from. What the students in that dojo witnessed was not the defeat of Japanese sword arts by Chinese kung fu. It was the demonstration of a principle that Bruce Lee had been arguing for throughout his martial arts life. That the boundary between styles, between weapons and unarmed, between Eastern and Western, between classical and modern, is not a boundary that exists in real combat. Those boundaries are human inventions. And a human invention can be dissolved by a human mind committed to looking at what is actually true. The story of what Miyamoto Kiko did afterward is worth noting. She spent the next 3 years studying Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do alongside her traditional sword arts. Not abandoning kendo and aikido, not deciding that the katana was worthless, but integrating. She went on to become one of Japan's most respected voices for cross-training between different martial systems, writing extensively about the necessity of testing traditional arts against other methodologies. She became, in other words, exactly the kind of practitioner that the encounter in the dojo had pointed toward. Someone who could hold the depth of a classical tradition and the openness of a questioning mind in the same hands. The legacy that outlasted the man Bruce Lee returned to Hong Kong the following day. He rarely spoke about the match publicly, considering it a private demonstration rather than a public triumph. He had never been interested in collecting trophies or in demonstrating superiority for its own sake. The match had meant something to him because it was a genuine test, not because it was a victory. The Japanese Sword Federation, when they learned of the event, requested that Master Yamamoto not distribute photographs or documentation. They were concerned, reasonably, that public knowledge of an unarmed fighter disarming a sword master would encourage dangerous imitation, that people would draw the wrong conclusions and put themselves in harm's way. The students kept their personal notes. The story circulated in martial arts circles through word of mouth, the way important stories tend to circulate quietly, among people who understand the weight of what they're carrying. Bruce Lee would be dead within 2 years. He died on July 20, 1973, at 32 years old, in Hong Kong, from a cerebral edema, a swelling of the brain, believed to have been triggered by an allergic reaction to a pain medication. He died before Enter the Dragon was released, before the worldwide explosion of his fame that film would ignite, before the world had fully processed what it had been given. He never saw himself become the icon he became. But the ideas he carried did not die with him. Dana White, the president of the UFC, has called Bruce Lee the father of modern mixed martial arts. This is not hyperbole. The entire conceptual foundation of MMA, the idea that a complete fighter needs to be competent across multiple ranges and disciplines, that stylistic loyalty is less important than effectiveness, that the question does this actually work against a skilled, resisting opponent? Must override every other consideration is the idea that Bruce Lee was insisting upon in every seminar, every private lesson, and every public demonstration he gave from the early 1960s until his death. Fighters like Conor McGregor, Anderson Silva, and John Jones have named him as a formative influence. The training camps of the world's elite mixed martial artists operate on principles that Bruce Lee would recognize immediately. Cross-training is not merely accepted in combat sports today, it is considered mandatory. The idea that a striking specialist who doesn't understand grappling, or a grappler who can't defend at range, is fundamentally incomplete. This idea is now so obvious that it barely gets stated. A half-century ago, Bruce Lee was being challenged in dojos for suggesting it. His philosophical writings, collected primarily in the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, published posthumously from his personal notes, have been read by millions of people who have no interest in martial arts whatsoever. His insights about adaptation, about the danger of becoming trapped in the forms you have mastered, about the need to be water, formless, taking the shape of whatever vessel you inhabit, resonate as life philosophy in ways that transcend their combat origins. And Time magazine named him one of the 100 most important people of the 20th century. Not as a martial artist. Not as a movie star. As someone who genuinely changed how human beings think about physical capability, about cultural exchange, about what a human body can become when a human mind commits fully to the question of its own limits. What remains the Shinjuku dojo where it happened is gone now. Master Yamamoto passed away years ago. Miyamoto Kiko is an old woman, if she is still living, who spent her life trying to build bridges between the traditions she inherited and the wider world of martial practice that a single evening in 1971 opened her to. And Bruce Lee is a photograph, a film reel, a set of notebooks, a philosophy, and yet somehow also something that is still moving, still active, still doing the thing he always tried to do, which is make whoever encounters it think more carefully about what is actually true versus what they have simply been told to believe. The katana that night was real. The danger was real. The silence in that dojo was real. And when the blade came down, and Bruce Lee moved not away from it but toward it, into the space inside the arc where the weapon's length becomes a liability, where the hand that holds the steel is more important than the steel itself, he was doing something he had spent 15 years building the capability to do. He was answering the question that all martial arts ultimately ask. Not what do you know, but what are you, when the moment arrives. He was 30 years old, barefoot on a cold floor, and he stepped forward. That's who Bruce Lee was. That's why we're still talking about him. If this story moved you, if you felt something shift in how you think about what a human being can become with 20 years of absolute commitment, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, more hidden moments from the lives of the people who actually changed what martial arts means in the modern world, subscribe to this channel. Every week, we go looking for the moments history almost forgot. The stories that deserve to be told.